There are some people in this world who seem to blend into the background. They walk through life without making much noise, without drawing attention, without leaving footprints that anyone bothers to follow. The boy in this story was one of those people. At least, that's what everyone thought. He was born in a small town in the southern part of the United States. The kind of place where everybody knows everybody, and news travels faster than the wind. His father worked at a factory that made car parts, coming home every evening with grease under his fingernails and exhaustion written across his face. His mother worked at a diner, serving coffee and pancakes to truckers passing through on their way to somewhere more important. They weren't poor in the way that makes headlines, but they weren't comfortable either. Every month was a careful dance of numbers, figuring out which bills could wait and which ones couldn't. The apartment they lived in sat above a laundromat, and the boy fell asleep every night to the rumble of washing machines and the smell of detergent drifting up through the floorboards. He was 7 years old when this story really begins, though you could argue it started long before that. See, even as a toddler, there was something different about him. His fingers never stopped moving. While other babies grabbed at toys and put everything in their mouths, he would tap. He'd tap on his high chair, on the floor, on his mother's arm, while she held him. It wasn't random either. There was rhythm to it, patterns that repeated and changed and grew more complex as he got older. His parents didn't think much of it. They had too many other things to worry about. Bills to pay, shifts to cover, a marriage that was slowly coming apart at the seams under the weight of too much work and too little rest. The boy's tapping was just background noise, like the washing machines downstairs. At school, he was invisible in the way that quiet kids often are. He wasn't bad at his studies, but he wasn't exceptional either. He sat in the back of the classroom, did his work, and rarely raised his hand. Teachers would sometimes forget he was there entirely, their eyes sliding right past him when they scanned the room. He didn't cause trouble, which meant he didn't get attention. The other kids didn't bully him exactly, but they didn't include him either. During recess, he'd sit alone on a bench, near the fence, watching the others play kickball and tag. Sometimes he'd trace patterns on the wooden slats of the bench, his fingers moving in those same rhythmic sequences that had been with him since birth. If anyone noticed, they didn't say anything. They just assumed he was weird and left him alone. His home life wasn't much better. His parents loved him. There was no doubt about that. But love doesn't always translate into presence. His father was too tired after 12-hour shifts to play catch in the yard. His mother was too stressed about the stack of bills on the kitchen counter to sit down and help with homework. They provided for him the best they could, but emotional connection was a luxury they couldn't afford, so the boy learned to be alone. He learned to entertain himself, to find comfort in the rhythm of his own fingers, against whatever surface was nearby. He'd tap on the kitchen table while eating cereal in the morning. He'd tap on his desk at school while waiting for the bell to ring. He'd tap on his pillow at night before falling asleep, creating compositions that existed only in his own mind. Years passed this way. 7 became 8. 8 became 9. The boy grew taller, but remained just as invisible. His report card said things like, quiet but capable, and needs to participate more in class. His parents signed them without really reading them, tucking them away in a drawer that was already overflowing with papers no one would ever look at again. But something was building inside him. He didn't have words for it yet, couldn't explain the pressure that seemed to grow in his chest whenever he heard music. It could be anything. A song on the radio at the diner where his mother worked, a commercial jingle on the television, even just the rhythm of rain against the window. Whenever he heard music, something inside him stirred. His fingers would start moving faster, more urgently, as if trying to capture something that kept slipping away. He'd never touched a musical instrument in his life. His family couldn't afford one, and the school's music program had been cut years ago due to budget constraints. Music was something that existed in the world around him, but never in his hands. It was like being hungry while watching other people eat through a window. One afternoon, When he was 9 years old, everything started to change. He was walking home from school, taking the long way because he wasn't in any hurry to return to an empty apartment. His mother was working the late shift, and his father wouldn't be home for hours. The route took him past the older part of town, where the houses were bigger and the lawns were greener. He heard it before he saw it. Piano music, floating out through an open window, like something from a dream. He'd heard piano before, of course, on TV and in movies. But this was different. This was real and close and so beautiful that it stopped him in his tracks. He stood on the sidewalk, frozen, listening. The music was complex, full of rises and falls, moments of gentle, quiet, followed by passages of intense emotion. He didn't know what the piece was called or who had composed it. He just knew that it was the most incredible thing he'd ever heard. Without realizing it, his fingers started moving. They danced in the air at his sides, following the music, pressing invisible keys. It felt natural, like breathing, like something his body had always known how to do, but never had the chance to try. The music stopped. A moment later, an elderly woman appeared in the window. She looked down at the boy on the sidewalk, at his fingers still moving even though there was nothing left to play. Their eyes met. She smiled at him, a warm smile that made him feel seen for the first time in longer than he could remember. Then he got scared. He wasn't supposed to be standing there, listening to someone else's music, looking into someone else's window. He turned and ran, his feet pounding against the pavement, his heart racing in his chest. That night, lying in bed, he couldn't stop thinking about what he'd heard. He pressed his fingers against the mattress, trying to recreate the movements he'd made on the sidewalk. But without the music, it felt empty, like speaking a language with no one to hear. He told himself it didn't matter. He told himself that piano was for other people, people with money and lessons and parents who had time to drive them to recitals. It wasn't for boys like him, invisible boys who lived above laundromats and ate cereal for dinner 3 nights a week. But the seed had been planted, and some seeds, once they take root, refuse to be ignored. He didn't know it yet, but his life was about to change in ways he couldn't possibly imagine. That moment on the sidewalk, that brief glimpse through someone else's window, had set something in motion that would eventually shock everyone who thought they knew him. Which, when you think about it, was basically everyone, because nobody really knew this boy at all. Not yet, but they would. Soon, the whole world would know his name, and every single person who had ever overlooked him, ignored him, or forgotten he existed, would remember that moment with crystal clarity. The moment they told him not to touch it. And what happened when he did? The news spread through the school like wildfire on a dry summer day. Someone important had donated money. Not just a little money, but the kind of money that made the principal's eyes go wide when she opened the letter. And with that money came a gift that would change everything. A grand piano. Now, you have to understand what this meant for a school like this one. They hadn't had a proper music program in years. Budget cuts had taken care of that. One slice at a time. Until all that remained were a few broken recorders in a dusty closet, and a music teacher who spent most of her time supervising lunch duty instead of teaching. But someone out there, some wealthy person whose name was never publicly revealed, had decided that the children of this small town deserved better. They donated enough money to restart the music program, buy new instruments, and crown it all with a grand piano that cost more than most of the teachers made in 2 years. The day it arrived was a Wednesday. The boy watched from the back of the crowd as workers wheeled it into the school, wrapped in moving blankets like some kind of precious secret. They set it up in the music room, a space that had been used for storage for so long that it took an entire weekend to clear it out. When the blankets came off, there was an audible gasp from everyone watching. The piano was beautiful, glossy, black, like the surface of a still lake at midnight. The keys were pristine, white and black, untouched, waiting. It sat there under the fluorescent lights like something from another world. something that didn't quite belong in a school where the ceiling tiles were stained and the heating barely worked. The music teacher, a stern woman who had been bitter about her reduced role for years, suddenly found herself important again. She stood in front of the piano like a guard protecting treasure, her arms crossed, her expression serious. "This instrument," she announced to the assembled students, "is worth more than you can imagine. It is not a toy. It is not to be touched, played with, or even approached without explicit permission. Do I make myself clear?" Everyone nodded. Everyone, except the boy, who stood at the back of the room, unable to take his eyes off the keys. Something was happening inside his chest. That same pressure he'd felt on the sidewalk months ago, but stronger now. Much stronger. A rope barrier was set up around the piano. Signs were posted, warning students to keep their distance. Permission to touch the instrument would be earned, the music teacher explained. Only by students who demonstrated exceptional commitment and talent through the new music program she was developing. Days passed. Then weeks. The music program started slowly, with basic lessons on recorder and simple percussion. Students who showed promise were given additional attention, groomed for the eventual privilege of sitting at the grand piano. The boy was not among them. He hadn't signed up for the program. His parents couldn't afford the small fee for materials, and he was too embarrassed to ask for a waiver. But every day, he found himself walking past the music room. He'd slow down as he passed the door, catching glimpses of the piano through the small window. Sometimes, he'd stop entirely, pressing his face against the glass, watching it sit there in silence. His fingers would start moving at his sides, tapping out rhythms only he could hear. Other students noticed his strange behavior. Some laughed. Others whispered to each other, confirming what they'd always suspected about the weird, quiet kid who sat alone at lunch. The music teacher noticed too. She'd shoo him away from the window with sharp words, reminding him that the piano was not for gawking at like an animal at the zoo. He tried to stop. He told himself it was stupid, this obsession with something he could never have. But the pull was too strong. Every time he tried to walk past without looking, his feet would slow down on their own. His eyes would drift toward the window, and his fingers, those restless fingers that had been tapping since before he could walk, would start their invisible dance. At night, he dreamed of piano keys. He'd wake up with his fingers moving against his pillow, pressing down on notes that weren't there. The dreams were vivid, filled with music he couldn't identify but somehow knew by heart. He'd lie awake afterward, staring at the ceiling, wondering if he was going crazy. One day, he built up the courage to ask his mother if he could join the music program. She was getting ready for her shift at the diner, moving quickly around their small kitchen, barely looking at him. "How much does it cost?" she asked. He told her the fee. It wasn't much, just enough to cover basic supplies. But he saw her face change, saw the calculation happening behind her eyes as she added this new number to all the others already competing for their limited money. "Maybe next semester," she said, grabbing her keys and heading for the door. "We'll see." He knew what that meant. It meant no. It meant maybe would turn into later, and later would turn into never. And eventually everyone would forget he'd ever asked. So he stopped asking. But he didn't stop wanting. The music teacher had developed a routine. Every day after the final bell, she'd spend an hour in the music room, organizing materials and preparing for the next day's lessons. Then, she'd lock the door and go home. The boy learned this routine by watching. He noted the time she left, which door she used, which direction she walked to her car. He wasn't planning anything. At least, that's what he told himself. He was just observing, just paying attention, just waiting for something, though he didn't know what. Then one Thursday afternoon, everything changed. The music teacher didn't come to school that day. Rumors spread quickly through the hallways. She was sick, really sick. The kind of sick that involved ambulances and hospitals and substitutes being called in at the last minute. Nobody knew exactly what had happened, but everyone knew she wouldn't be back for a while. The substitute was overwhelmed, unable to keep track of all the responsibilities that had suddenly been dumped in her lap. In the chaos, small details were overlooked. Rooms were left unlocked. Rules were forgotten. The boy discovered this by accident. He was taking his usual route past the music room, slowing down to look through the window, as he always did. But this time, something was different. The door was slightly open. Not much, just a crack, but enough to notice. He stopped. His heart started pounding. He looked up and down the hallway. Empty. Everyone had gone home, or was in after-school activities, on the other side of the building. The only sound was the hum of the ventilation system and the distant thump of a basketball in the gym. He should walk away. He knew that. The smart thing, the safe thing, would be to pretend he hadn't noticed and keep moving. Nothing good could come from what he was thinking about doing. But his feet had other plans. He found himself at the door, his hand on the handle. The metal was cool against his palm. He could still turn back. He could still be the invisible boy who followed all the rules and never made waves. His fingers were tapping against his leg, faster than ever, urgent and insistent. He pushed the door open and stepped inside. The room was dim. The afternoon sun came through the windows at an angle, casting long shadows across the floor. And there it was. The piano, without the rope barrier, which someone had moved aside during the day, without anyone standing guard, just sitting there, waiting. He walked toward it slowly, as if approaching a wild animal that might spook and run away. Each step felt monumental. Each breath felt loud in the silence. His fingers were trembling now, not with fear but with something else entirely. Anticipation. Need. He reached the bench. It was padded with black leather, worn slightly at the edges from the few students who had been allowed to sit there under strict supervision. He touched it with his fingertips, half expecting an alarm to go off. Nothing happened. He sat down. The keys stretched out before him, a landscape of black and white that seemed to extend forever in both directions. He'd never been this close to a piano before. He'd never smelled the wood and polish, never felt the weight of a real instrument waiting beneath his hands. His fingers hovered over the keys. In his mind, he could already hear the music. It was always there, that endless symphony playing in his head, getting louder and more insistent with every passing day. And now, finally, he had a way to let it out. They had told him not to touch it, but some things are stronger than rules. Some things are stronger than fear. Some things have been building for so long that when they finally break free, nothing in the world can hold them back. He took a deep breath, and his fingers came down on the keys. The first note rang out like a bell in the silence. Pure. Perfect. It hung in the air for a moment, vibrating through the empty room, through the boy's body, through everything. And then came the second note, and the third. And suddenly, his fingers were moving in ways he couldn't control, couldn't explain, couldn't stop. What came out of that piano was not the clumsy exploration of a child who had never touched an instrument. It was not the hesitant poking of keys, the hunt and peck of someone learning where the notes lived. No, what came out was something else entirely. It was music. Real music. Complex, layered, beautiful music that seemed to flow from somewhere deep inside him, through his arms, through his fingers, and into the keys. He didn't think about what to play. He didn't decide which notes to hit. His hands simply moved, and the music poured out like water from a broken dam. The piece was classical. He would later learn it was one of the most difficult compositions ever written for piano, a piece that professional musicians studied for years before attempting to perform. It required technical skill that took decades to develop. It demanded emotional depth that most players never achieved. The boy played it perfectly. His small fingers flew across the keyboard with precision that seemed impossible. He reached for notes that should have been too far apart, hit combinations that should have been too complex, navigated passages that should have been too fast. But everything flowed. Everything connected. Everything was exactly right. He lost himself in the music. Time stopped having meaning. The room around him faded away until there was nothing but the piano, the keys, and the endless river of sound that was finally being released after 9 years of silence. Tears were streaming down his face. He didn't know why. He wasn't sad. He wasn't even happy. Exactly. It was something bigger than that. Something that didn't have a name. It was like being trapped underground his entire life and suddenly breaking through to the surface, seeing the sun for the first time, filling his lungs with fresh air. The music swelled. It climbed to impossible heights, then descended into passages of heartbreaking tenderness. It told a story without words, a story of struggle and hope, and the beautiful, painful experience of being alive in a world that doesn't always see you. He didn't know how long he played. It could have been minutes. It could have been hours. He was aware of nothing, except the music, and the overwhelming sense that this was what he was meant to do. This was who he was supposed to be. Everything else, all those years of invisibility and loneliness, had just been waiting for this moment. The piece reached its final movement. His fingers danced through the conclusion. Every note falling exactly where it should, every phrase perfectly shaped, and then, with one last chord that seemed to contain every emotion he'd ever felt, it was over. He lifted his hands from the keys. The silence rushed back in. But it was different now. Fuller. Changed. He opened his eyes. Standing in the doorway were 3 people. The first was the school janitor, an older man who had worked at the school for 30 years and thought he'd seen everything. His mouth was hanging open. His mop had fallen from his hands and lay forgotten on the floor. The second was the principal, a no-nonsense woman who had come to investigate reports of strange sounds coming from the music room. She was gripping the doorframe, like she needed it to stay standing. Her face was wet with tears. The third was the music teacher. She had heard about the substitute's negligence from a colleague and had dragged herself out of her hospital bed against doctor's orders to make sure her precious piano was safe. She had arrived just as the music began and had stood frozen in the hallway, unable to move, unable to breathe, listening to something impossible. For a long moment, nobody spoke. The boy stared at them, his fingers still trembling, his heart pounding so hard he could feel it in his throat. He was caught. He was in trouble. He had touched the piano when everyone had told him not to, and now he was going to be punished. He opened his mouth to apologize, to explain, to beg for forgiveness. But before he could say anything, the music teacher did something he never would have expected. She started crying harder. Not angry crying, not upset crying. The kind of crying you do when something breaks open inside you and you can't hold it back anymore. "Who taught you to play like that?" she whispered. The boy looked at her, confused. "Nobody," he said. "I've never had a lesson. I've never touched a piano before." The 3 adults exchanged glances. The kind of glances that said they were all thinking the same impossible thing. "That's not possible," the principal said. But her voice was uncertain, shaky. "What you just played, that piece. Professionals can't play it that well." The janitor finally bent down to pick up his mop, moving slowly like someone in a dream. "I don't know much about music. Ring 10? I was," he said quietly. "But I know what I just heard. And that wasn't normal." The music teacher walked forward, her steps unsteady. She stopped in front of the piano, looking down at the boy with an expression he couldn't read. "Fear? Wonder? Disbelief? Play something else," she said. He hesitated. "I don't know if I can." "Try." He turned back to the piano. His fingers hovered over the keys again. For a terrifying moment, he thought it was gone, that whatever had possessed him had vanished as quickly as it came. But then the music started flowing again. Different this time. A piece he'd heard once on a television in the background of the diner where his mother worked. It was Mozart, a concerto meant for full orchestra. But his fingers found a way to carry the melody and the accompaniment simultaneously, creating layers of sound that shouldn't have been possible from a single player. The music filled the room, bouncing off the walls, swelling to fill every corner. When he finished, the music teacher was crying again. So was the principal. The janitor had sat down on the floor, his back against the wall, just staring. "How?" the music teacher asked. "How is this possible?" The boy shook his head. "I don't know. I've always heard music. In my head. All the time. I never had anything to play it on before." What happened next was a blur. Phone calls were made. The boy's parents were contacted. They arrived at the school confused and frightened, thinking their son was in some kind of trouble. When the music teacher explained what had happened, they didn't believe it. How could they? Their quiet, unremarkable son, the one they barely had time to notice? A musical genius? "Show them," the music teacher said. The boy played again. A different piece this time. His father stood frozen, tears streaming down his face, watching his son do something impossible. That night, no one slept. The boy played for hours, piece after piece after piece, everything that had been trapped inside him, finally finding release. People came to listen. Teachers, parents of other students, neighbors who had heard rumors and had to see for themselves. By morning, someone had recorded a video on their phone. By afternoon, that video had been shared hundreds of times. By the next day, it had gone viral, spreading across the internet like a wildfire that no one could contain. The world had noticed, and the boy who had been invisible his entire life suddenly found himself at the center of attention he couldn't possibly have prepared for. They had told him not to touch it. But what his fingers did when they finally made contact with those keys shocked everyone. It shocked his parents, who realized they'd been living with a miracle without knowing it. It shocked his teachers, who had to face the fact that they'd overlooked something extraordinary. It shocked experts, who would spend years trying to explain what couldn't be explained. But most of all, it shocked the boy himself. Because for 9 years, he'd believed what everyone told him. That he was ordinary. That he was unremarkable. That he was destined for a small, quiet life in a small, quiet town. That night, sitting in his room above the laundromat, while his mother cried happy tears and his father paced back and forth in disbelief, he finally understood. He wasn't ordinary at all. He never had been. And his life would never be the same again. The video reached 1 million views in less than 48 hours. By the end of the week, it had been seen by over 20 million people around the world. News stations picked it up. Talk shows debated it. Music experts analyzed it frame by frame, trying to understand what they were seeing. A 9-year-old boy with no training, no lessons, no musical background whatsoever, playing one of the most difficult piano compositions in history, like he'd been doing it his whole life. The comments section exploded. Some people called it fake, a hoax, a clever edit designed to fool gullible viewers. But the video had been taken by multiple people, from multiple angles. The school had security footage. There was no way to fake what had happened in that music room. Others called it a miracle, a gift from God, proof of something supernatural. Churches reached out, wanting to tell his story from their pulpits. Spiritual leaders from various traditions claimed him as evidence of divine intervention. Scientists had their own explanations. Terms like savant syndrome and latent genius started appearing in articles and television segments. Doctors who had never met the boy offered theories about unusual brain development, hidden neural pathways, genetic anomalies that could explain the unexplainable. Through all of it, the boy sat in his small apartment above the laundromat, watching his life change minute by minute, and not understanding any of it. The first reporters arrived on a Tuesday, 3 days after the video went viral. They knocked on doors, asked neighbors for interviews, set up cameras on the sidewalk outside his building. His parents, overwhelmed and frightened, kept the curtains closed and didn't answer the phone. But they couldn't hide forever. A local news station finally convinced his mother to let them in for an interview. The boy sat on the worn couch in their living room, camera lights bright in his face, and answered questions he didn't know how to answer. "How did you learn to play?" the reporter asked. "I didn't," he said. "I just played." "But you must have practiced somewhere." "Secretly? At a friend's house?" He shook his head. "I've never touched a piano before that day. I don't know how to explain it. The music is just in my head. It's always been there." The interview aired that night. By morning, the offers started coming in. A famous music academy offered him a full scholarship. A record label wanted to sign him immediately. A billionaire philanthropist offered to pay for his family to relocate to any city in the world, with housing and living expenses covered indefinitely. His parents didn't know what to do. They were simple people who had never imagined a life beyond their small town. Now they were being asked to make decisions that would shape their son's future in ways they couldn't comprehend. Meanwhile, the experts arrived. First came the music professors, flying in from universities and conservatories around the globe. They gave him pieces to play, compositions he'd never seen before, written by composers he'd never heard of. He played them perfectly after a single glance at the sheet music. When they asked how, he couldn't answer. He didn't read music. He didn't understand notation. He just looked at the pages and somehow knew what they meant. Next came the doctors. Neurologists, psychologists, specialists in rare brain conditions. They ran tests, lots of tests, brain scans, cognitive assessments, hearing evaluations, genetic analyses. They poked and prodded and asked questions until the boy's head hurt, and his mother finally put her foot down and demanded they stop. The results came back puzzling. His brain showed unusual activity patterns, but nothing that explained his ability. His IQ was above average, but not extraordinary. There was no evidence of the classic markers associated with savant syndrome. By all measurable standards, he was a normal, 9-year-old boy, except for the music. The attention was relentless. Everywhere he went, people recognized him. Kids at school who had ignored him for years suddenly wanted to be his friend. Teachers who had forgotten his name now watched him with awe and something that looked almost like fear. Even the music teacher, who had guarded that piano so fiercely, now deferred to him completely, asking permission before she touched the keys. It was overwhelming. He didn't know how to handle it. For 9 years, he'd been invisible, and he'd made peace with that. Now he was seen by everyone, all the time, and he felt more alone than ever. His parents struggled too. His father didn't know how to relate to a son who had suddenly become world famous. His mother tried to protect him but found herself drowning in paperwork and phone calls and decisions she wasn't qualified to make. The stress that had been slowly breaking their marriage now had new fuel to burn. One night, about a month after the video went viral, the boy sat at the piano in his school's music room. It was late, after hours, but the school had given him unlimited access to the instrument. They had no choice. Trying to keep him away from it would be like trying to keep a fish out of water. He played quietly, not performing for anyone, just letting the music flow. A teacher found him there, one of the older ones who had been at the school for decades. "Everyone's talking about what you can do," she said, sitting down on a chair nearby. "But nobody's asking how you're doing." He stopped playing and looked at her. In all the chaos, all the interviews and tests and attention, nobody had asked him that simple question. "I don't know," he admitted. "I used to be invisible. Now everyone sees me. But I'm not sure they see me. They just see this thing I can do." The teacher nodded slowly. "That's a wise observation for someone your age. I hear music all the time," he continued, the words coming out before he could stop them. Even when I'm not playing, even when I'm sleeping, it never stops. Sometimes, I wonder if it's a gift or a curse. Maybe it's both, the teacher said. Most precious things are. The weeks turned into months. Decisions were made, carefully and reluctantly. His family moved to a larger city, funded by one of the many benefactors who had emerged from the chaos. He enrolled in a special program that would allow him to continue his education while also developing his musical abilities. He performed his first public concert at age 10 in a small but prestigious venue. The audience was filled with critics, musicians, and curious observers who had heard the stories and needed to see for themselves. When he walked out onto the stage, a small figure in an oversized suit, many of them were already skeptical. Then he played. The concert lasted 2 hours. He performed pieces by composers who had lived centuries ago, their music flowing through his fingers as if they were guiding his hands from beyond the grave. When he finished, the audience sat in stunned silence for a long moment before erupting into applause that seemed to shake the building. Reviews were published the next day. Words like unprecedented and once in a generation and impossible to explain appeared over and over again. Critics who had expected disappointment found themselves struggling to describe what they had witnessed. But fame, as the boy was quickly learning, comes with costs. Privacy became impossible. Normal childhood experiences became distant memories. Friendships became complicated by the reality that everyone wanted something from him. His parents' marriage finally crumbled under the pressure, his father moving to another state while his mother stayed to manage the chaos. Through it all, he kept playing. Because the music never stopped. Because it was the only thing that made sense anymore. Because when his fingers touched the keys, he felt like himself. Not the phenomenon or the mystery or the story, but just a boy who heard music that nobody else could hear and had finally found a way to share it. He was famous now, known around the world, praised and analyzed and debated and celebrated. But deep down, he was still that quiet kid from the laundromat apartment, wondering if anyone would ever really see him for who he was, beyond what he could do. And wondering, sometimes late at night when the music got too loud in his head, if this gift that had given him everything might also be the thing that eventually cost him everything too. That question would be answered soon enough, but not in the way anyone expected. By the time he turned 16, the boy had performed on 5 continents. He had played for presidents, prime ministers, and royalty. His recordings had sold millions of copies. His name was spoken in the same breath as the greatest pianists in history, legends who had spent entire lifetimes building reputations that he had somehow surpassed before he could legally drive a car. From the outside, his life looked like a fairy tale. Private jets, luxury hotels, audiences who wept at his performances, and paid thousands of dollars just to be in the same room when he played. He had everything that most people spend their whole lives chasing. From the inside, it was different. His father had remarried and started a new family. They spoke occasionally, awkward phone calls that always seemed to end too quickly. His mother had become his manager, a role that had slowly transformed their relationship from parent and child to something more like business partners. She handled the contracts and the schedules and the negotiations. He handled the music. That was the deal. He didn't have friends. Not real ones. Anyway, everyone he met either wanted something from him or was intimidated by him. Kids his own age didn't know how to relate to someone who had achieved more by 16 than most people achieve in a lifetime. Adults treated him like a precious artifact, something to be admired and protected but never really known. The music was still there, constant and inescapable. If anything, it had grown louder over the years. Some nights, he would lie awake for hours, melodies and harmonies swirling through his mind, refusing to let him rest. He played until his fingers ached, until his back was sore, until exhaustion finally overwhelmed the endless symphony in his head. Sometimes he wondered what it would be like to be ordinary, To wake up in the morning without music already playing behind his eyes. To go to a normal school, have normal friends, live a normal life. To be invisible again, the way he had been before that afternoon in the music room, but there was no going back. That boy, the quiet one who pressed his face against the window and dreamed of touching the keys, was gone. Replaced by someone he didn't always recognize. On the night of his 16th birthday, he performed in Vienna, one of the great musical capitals of the world. The concert hall was packed with 3,000 people, each one holding their breath as he walked onto the stage. The silence was so complete that he could hear his own footsteps echoing off the walls. He sat down at the piano, a Steinway, one of the finest instruments ever made. Its keys gleamed under the stage lights, waiting for his touch. For a moment, he just sat there. He thought about the journey that had brought him to this place. The laundromat apartment. The forbidden piano. The moment everything changed. All the years since, the triumphs and the struggles, the gifts and the costs. Then, he began to play. The piece was one of the most challenging in the classical repertoire, a work that represented the summit of what was possible on the piano. He had performed it many times before, but tonight felt different. Tonight, something was shifting inside him. As he played, his mind wandered to all the people who had shaped his life. His mother, exhausted and devoted, sitting in the front row as she always did. His father, somewhere far away, probably not even aware that tonight was anything special. The music teacher who had told him not to touch the piano, who had cried when she heard what he could do, the janitor who had dropped his mop, the principal who had gripped the doorframe like her life depended on it. All those people who had looked at him and seen something they couldn't explain. A mystery, a miracle, a phenomenon. But did any of them see him? The real him? The boy who still felt lonely in crowded rooms? The teenager who sometimes wished the music would just stop for a few minutes so he could think clearly? The person behind the gift? The piece reached its climax, a passage of extraordinary complexity that required every ounce of his concentration. His fingers flew across the keys, producing sounds that seemed to transcend what was physically possible. The audience was transfixed, tears streaming down faces, hearts pounding in chests, and then it was over. The final chord rang out and faded into silence. The applause was thunderous. People stood from their seats, crying and cheering. They wanted more. They always wanted more. He had given them everything he had, and they still wanted more. After the concert, a young journalist approached him for an interview. She was different from the others, more thoughtful, more curious about him as a person, rather than as a story. She asked the question that everyone had been asking since that first viral video, but she asked it differently. "Where do you think it comes from?" she said. "The music?" He was quiet for a long moment. 7 years of being asked this question, and he still didn't have an answer that satisfied anyone, including himself. "I don't know," he finally said. "I've stopped asking." The journalist waited, sensing there was more. "For a long time I needed to understand it," he continued. "I needed to know why I could do what I do, where it came from, what it meant. I thought if I could figure it out, everything else would make sense too." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "But some things aren't meant to be understood. They're just meant to be shared. I can spend my whole life trying to explain something that has no explanation, or I can just be grateful that it exists and do my best to honor it." The journalist nodded slowly. "Do you ever regret it? The fame? The pressure? Everything you've had to give up?" He thought about the question, about his father, about the friends he never made, about the normal childhood that was taken from him, or maybe that he had taken from himself, depending on how you looked at it. "Sometimes," he admitted, "late at night, when I can't sleep and the music won't stop, I think about what my life might have been like if I'd never walked into that room, if I'd just kept walking past that door like I was supposed to." He smiled then, a sad smile that made him look older than his years. But then I sit down at the piano and start to play, and I remember that this is what I was made for. This is who I am. The rest of it, the fame, and the pressure, and the loneliness, that's just the price. And some gifts are worth any price. That night, after the interviews were done and the hall was empty, he returned to the stage alone. The Steinway sat there waiting for him, patient and perfect, the way pianos always waited. He sat down and began to play something new. Not a classical piece, not something anyone had ever heard before. This was his own music, a composition he had been building in his head for years, piece by piece, note by note. It was a piece about everything, about being invisible and being seen, about gifts and curses, about loneliness and connection, about the beautiful, terrible weight of being touched by something greater than yourself. He played for hours. Nobody heard it except him and the empty seats and the echoes bouncing off the walls. When he finally stopped, there were tears on his face. The same kind of tears that had fallen that first day when his fingers touched the keys for the first time and released something that had been waiting inside him his entire life. He understood now. The music wasn't just something he did. It was who he was. It was the part of him that mattered most. The part that connected him to something bigger than his small, complicated life. They had told him not to touch it, but what his fingers did shocked everyone. Not just that first day, but every day since. Every performance, every note, every moment when he sat down at a piano and shared the endless symphony that played in his head. He didn't know why he was chosen for this gift. He didn't know what any of it meant in the grand scheme of things. But he knew one thing, with absolute certainty. He would keep playing. For as long as there was breath in his body and strength in his fingers, he would keep playing. Because some things aren't meant to be explained. They're just meant to be shared. And that, more than anything else, was the lesson of his extraordinary life. A lesson written in black and white keys, in impossible melodies, in the quiet wonder of a boy who was told not to touch something and changed the world when he did.